so I don't forget. Anyway, we started out with some assumptions about things that are pretty universal to politics of any kind. We talked about power as legitimate authority, which, by the way, has been coming up a lot lately in different ways when people are talking about, the American election and whether or not it can be seen as legitimate, which in turn can impinge upon the authority of the and sense of legitimacy of the person who inhabits the White House. And, was the election rigged? And there's no evidence of that, but people keep claiming it. Some people. That's about legitimate authority. And the idea is we're going to undermine your power by casting doubts about the legitimacy of your presidency. And that's what's going on. We saw a little bit of that right after the Bush-Gore election in 2000, but that dissipated pretty quickly. And the primary reason why it did was because once they had the recount, see, initially Gore had conceded. Then it was like, hey, no, wait a minute. We got some problems in Florida. So he's like, well, sorry, I got to withdraw my concession, which was a little bit bad form. But as it turned out, kind of prescient, because they did a recount, very controversial recount. The court intervenes, any number of things happen. There was always this kind of doubt cast over the legitimacy of the George W. Bush administration. And a lot of people have actually, a lot of sort of armchair historians have speculated that absent 9/11, in this sort of rally around the flag effect that you see, where when a country is threatened to any degree of significance, or if there's a natural disaster or anything like that, people tend to flock around their leader. It's called rally around the flag. After 9/11, that's exactly what happened with George W. Bush, because his approval ratings and the sense that of his legitimacy were still very much in doubt in September of 2001. And, he'd done some things that were kind of controversial, $40 million to the Taliban and things like that. There were concerns about his connections to big oil and a lot of other things, real and imagined. He gained a lot of legitimacy as a consequence of appearing to sort of lead the country through a crisis. I don't mean appearing in the sense that he didn't do it, but I mean, he was visible and sort of, standing up in the rubble with his megaphone and saying, we're going to put a boot up their ass and whatever, So these concepts we started with, of power as opposed to force, you look at countries that have to rig elections. You look at Belarus, for example. That election's clearly crooked. It's rigged. Okay, well, there's not a lot of legitimacy there. That means that president, insofar as he stays in power, is going to have to rule more by force, because he doesn't have the confidence of the international community, but he also doesn't have a lot of confidence within his own country. And we see these kinds of things happen. That's where this concept of legitimate authority comes in. And the broader sense of institutions, one of the functions of political institutions is to ensure the integrity of political exchange, so that when we're making public decisions about who gets what, when, and how, the ways in which we do that reinforce the idea that once it's realized, the decision is legitimate. Okay? And on and on and on. I mean, I don't have to review the whole class. When we talked about Aristotle, Plato, we talked about Machiavelli, whoever we talked about, we kept kind of returning to this idea of, well, how do they see power? How do they see it working? What makes a successful prince powerful? And even there, with an absolutist like Machiavelli appears to be in The Prince, there still is this sense, right, of don't tyrannize people, don't prey upon the people, don't oppress them. It's the only thing that they want, is that you not oppress them, which means you then retain a sense of legitimate authority, and so you have power over them. So what I'm suggesting is that every one of these political theories we've looked at, it has some basis in this concern about maintaining legitimacy, your ability to do things and not have those things be contested in such a way as to undo them. Does that make sense? All right. So now, because, my work here is done almost, but yours is only beginning, I want you to tell me, okay, because if you notice, if you look at the Moodle page right now, your last assignment is visible. a description of it. It's a pretty extensive description. It's intended to guide you rather than command you. There are a lot of ways that you can get at that assignment. Play to your strength. Emphasize the things that you understand best. But essentially what I want you to do is, okay, just take the world as it is right now. Take human beings as you understand them to be right now. Take the United States as you understand it to be right now. And then tell me, okay, going forward, if you were to build a political theory, a philosophy of how things ought to be, as opposed to how they are, how they ought to be, what would need to be changed and why? And what would you retain and why? What institutions, if you have to add new institutions, how do you do that? How do you get people to trust them? You know, one of the obvious things would be, well, we should eliminate the Electoral College. There's no way that in back-to-back elections, a candidate would run the risk of losing the popular vote. We'd have somebody lose the popular vote twice, but maybe twice be elected president. Obviously, this time it didn't happen, but there was concern that it might. I mean, everyone was pretty sure that Trump was going to lose the popular vote. He lost by, I think, 5 million votes. But what people were concerned about is, what's this going to do to this republic if somebody who loses the election wins the election, not once but twice? So you might say, well, one of the things we need to do to improve the legitimacy of presidential governance, such as we have it, would be, you know, we need to make sure that the legitimate authority of the office holder is a direct reflection of the will of the people. Does that, you see what I'm saying? In other words, you know, we can alter an existing institution, the presidential election, by abolishing the Electoral College. Let's just do away with it. Or you might say, well, wait a minute, this is actually something that's been proposed. We could leave that to the states, and the states determine disproportionately under the Bill of Rights the time, place, and manner of elections. States can decide whether or not the electoral vote has to reflect the popular vote or what. And there are a number of states who have tried to sign on to a movement to agree amongst themselves that their electoral votes will go to the person who wins the national popular vote, notwithstanding what happens in their own state. Okay, that's pretty extraordinary, but it's something the state can do. Okay, so those are some basic changes, but you might just think, you know what, the real problem with this is we're hyper materialistic because we commodify everything and we try to monetize everything, and everything is about buying and selling, and we don't have any core to our culture. You know, Americans don't know what they believe in anymore. They just want a new phone. Or, you know, Americans don't know what's right or wrong. You know, they just want to binge watch, you know, the next, you know, Game of Thrones or whatever. And so what we need to do is what? You know, do we need to change our educational system? You know, remember that we talked about this briefly. If you had read the entire Republic, Plato emphasizes a lot the kind of curative principle embedded in education. You can cure a lot of ills with good education. I mean, that's why we have legally mandated education for all American minors with almost no exceptions. Okay, the idea being we will be a better society for that. So you might say, well, you know, we need to somehow change the educational system so that it, you know, it de-emphasizes confrontation and competition, and it emphasizes cooperation, and also it emphasizes anti-materialist or counter-materialist values. Like we have to have more sense of the value of, you know, justice, or a value of equity, fairness, something like that. And we don't really do that. That is, by the way, happening in the public education system in K through 12 in the United States for a variety of reasons. One of which is it's been taken over disproportionately by women, many of whom are feminists. And those values have found their way into the mainstream of K through 12 education, such that you were socialized in public education in a way that would have been unrecognizable to my generation. You know, when I grew up, school teachers could still use corporal punishment. They could still beat you and things like, and did. You know, everything was kind of predicated on competition and getting gold stars and being better than everybody else. And, that's been de-emphasized, not universally, but as a tendency overall in the American sort of educational environment. A lot of those things have changed. And we've seen movements toward, I don't know, it sounds silly, but things like participation trophies, right? In other words, let's de-emphasize competition. Everybody's a winner. Well, we know that in the real world, there are many situations where everybody doesn't win. That's what winning is. You get something no one else gets. So do we want that or not? You see, we have a contradiction, perhaps, in American culture. So I'm asking you, if you were, obviously I'm asking you formally on this last assignment, but I want to hear from you. There's your benediction and preamble. Okay, now you write the Constitution. What would you say, first of all, do you recognize as pretty fundamentally working in American culture, the American economy, American politics? And so whatever else we change, we probably don't want to disturb this. Is there anything like that you can think of? I would imagine there'd be something. You legal voters, you. We just got done talking about Marx's critique of liberalism, right? And his concern is that under capitalism, we have not only an economic system, but a power structure that is predicated on exploitation, that's predicated on the few using the many as a means to an end. And so ultimately denying them full human emancipation, their realization of their potential as human beings. Okay, kind of hearkening back to the almost idealistic, although naturalistically idealistic notion of Aristotle, that we're all by nature political, social animals, and that really the highest expression of humanity is participation in public life. If instead you make meaningful limitations on the kind of actual decisions that the majority of people can make because they're simply not sufficiently wealthy, have you undermined that? Is that a problem in the United States, or does that sort of work? I mean, is it a meritocracy? Is that a good thing? Should we have a revolution? Should we eat the rich? Which I got into a lot of trouble. I think I might have mentioned this. I got in a lot of trouble for teaching my youngest boy to say eat the rich, because I thought that was really funny. Nobody else did, but I did.
I think it's probably a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, but tell me how. How is it? I'm sorry, man. It's country simple. The problem in this country is the 1%. There's no question of that.
Well, I mean, I think
he argues in character.
I think people like Marx, were fairly good at diagnosing problems with capitalism. But the things, as a clinician, the things that they prescribed, I don't think were so good.
What did they prescribe that isn't good?
Well, I mean, just a lot of the countries, I could be drawing a bad parallel here, but, a lot of countries during the Cold War that, set up these socialist states.
Like Sweden?
Well, maybe not. Like Poland.
No, Poland did not set up a socialist state.
No?
They had communism imposed on them. They had, Soviet national fascism imposed on them. That's not really a fair comparison. That isn't what Marx was talking about.
Yeah. Well,
the individual, in terms of realizing the product of their labor, was never realized.
Right. Yeah, I get that. I'm just, like I said, I'm probably drawing a bad parallel there.
No, but think about what didn't work, because then you know what you'd want to avoid. Was it the principle or was it the implementation? And is there a way, is the principle so idealistic that there's no proper implementation for it?
I think there's probably some truth to that.
Okay. So what do you say to the Scandinavian countries?
I mean, I think they're doing a lot of things right, but they're not necessarily like, I don't think they're necessarily like a socialist utopia as Marx.
Well, again, we're not
them.
talking about utopia. We're talking about the best we can do. Remember what I mean? I'm
Right.
not asking you to develop a perfect society. We're human beings. Nothing we create is perfect. That's true. But
I think
remember
they
what
have
I'm
a lot of.
asking you is what we started with. What is there about the society you live in right now that you think reflects appropriate values that ought to be preserved given whatever changes you might propose? So it doesn't, I mean, I use Marx and socialism and anti-capitalism as just the most extreme possibility. You know, I mean, I assume the role of a raving Marxist, but, you know, I think there are plenty of ways to critique the American system without being a Marxist. So how might you, what would you want to keep first? What works? Does the American educational system work? Not is it perfect, does it work? Do we have a highly literate, well-educated population? Okay, Sarah says no. And based on what evidence, Sarah? And also B says, no, we don't. What are we missing? Are we not well-educated?
I think we can do better.
Well, and again, we've mentioned before, we're not aiming for perfection here. What we're saying is, what would we want to keep? Because even though we might be able to tweak it and make it better, it works. So whatever we do, we don't want to break that because it ain't broken. That's what I mean. I'm not explaining myself well, I guess. But I would concede that anything that human beings do could be done better. We're well educated, but not well enough to be competitive with other developed countries. We have the largest and most diverse economy in the universe. I think we're doing pretty well. I have to try and argue against you. We have very high rates of literacy. Now, you're right in that compared to other like OECD countries, other developed countries, Americans on average score significantly less well in math and science. And yet, the United States has been a kind of magnet for people who do score high in math and science from other parts of the world who want to come here and live here and develop their ideas here. So it seems like that's working. So something must be attracting them. What about the American university system? Knowing that the vast majority of Americans will never complete a degree in that system, which doesn't mean it's either good or bad. What would you change about since you're in it, what would you change about the university system? Now, remember, in order to answer that question with any kind of degree of depth, you have to first ask yourself, well, what's its function? I know what its nature is as an institution. I know what it looks like. What is its function? Now, depending on what you reform or what you destroy or what you preserve, right, the choices there are going to depend on what you think the functions of those things are or ought to be. And you might argue, well, you know, our K through 12 system functions. We have rates of literacy that are comparable with the developed world. Okay, maybe we don't do as well as we could. Sarah's obviously right. We don't. We could certainly do better. So what could we do? What could we change in our educational system to get better results, I guess? That's going to depend on what you think the function or purpose of education should be. So what, K through 12 education, what's it for? Because by knowing what it's for, we'll know whether or not it's working.
Well, I believe that what its function mainly is to sort of like get people like on the right track, you know, knowledge wise, and sort of making sure that when they get to, you know, the age of like 18 per se, they kind of know what they're doing in life. Like that's what I feel like the function of that is sort of like taking steps through, you know, growing up. I don't think it does that perfectly, but I feel like that's what it should be. It should be
So
like
education
preparing
is
yourself.
responsible for growing you up.
Well, partially because you're learning things that, you know, are sort of, I guess, important to, you know, getting to things like college and getting a job. You know, you need to know basic things in order to get a job.
Is the in your sense of it is, we'll get to higher education in a second, but we're talking about K through 12 right now, John. Is K through 12 preparing young Americans for life after high school?
I don't
Sarah,
think the
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I don't think the current one is. I'm just saying, like, that's what I feel like the function is meant to be,
Well,
but I don't feel like that's what it
Okay,
does.
what are we not learning in K through 12? Because Sarah was, I missed that just a second. In fact, I want to look at it, but if I do, it screws up my screen. But it's something like preparing people more or less to kind of cope with life, to succeed in life. Seems to me your parents ought to be doing a lot of that.
Like I feel that, especially more high school, that they should have more mandatory classes to like, so people, because I know a lot of people will tend to get higher, and some people will try to get higher education, but then there's others who will not try to advance to higher education. So I feel like high school should be able to teach people how to do basic stuff like how to file your taxes properly, or how to manage checkbook or something like that, where something you will need no matter how old you are. Like, for example, when my parents were in high school, they had cooking class and wood shop, stuff like that, stuff you probably will need in the future. But now we just learn about geometry and stuff, not how to properly.
We always had
finance
geometry and
yourself.
stuff.
Well, I know, but not properly learn how to to balance a checkbook and properly organize your taxes and stuff like that.
Okay, that's a great point. So then one of the things you might think about is, look, we're going to agree that we are living in a society where people have a certain responsibility for themselves. Okay, we're also in a society where those people have an obligation to the society at large. They realize that obligation largely in two ways. One, they obey the law. Two, they pay taxes. So one of the things we ought to do if we want to create better citizens is, first of all, do a better job of explaining to people circa sophomore year of high school, this is what taxes are, this is what we do with them, this is what the Internal Revenue Service is, and this is how you fill out a tax form, right? And things like that. Or somebody mentioned, I'm amazed that someone would still mention balancing a checkbook. I don't know that we do that much anymore, since a lot of us bank online, but things like that. In other words, I don't think you learn very much in K through 12 in a capitalist, materialist, consumer-driven economy about how to be a safe consumer. I mean, we learn a lot from advertising about how to be a profligate consumer and spend ourselves into debt. You know, the private sector is doing a wonderful job of educating us there. But I don't think that K through 12 does a very good job of helping us understand how to manage money and how to mitigate debt and things like that. And it seems to me that that's something that you know, I think, Raphael, as you suggest, by the time you're in high school, a lot of you are having your first job, you know, and things like that. You ought to understand money. You ought to understand how to manage money. You don't have to be a capitalist and buy stock or anything, but it would be nice to understand why your parents freak out every April 15th, you know, and then it's not you, you know. Okay, so there might be things we can tweak there. Do we? I mean, how many of you had something like auto shop, metal shop, wood shop, sort of practical applied skill classes, those shop classes? How many of you had?
I did.
Yeah.
My high school required it.
Yeah. See, yeah, I did too. And I didn't always like them because that was where all the gearheads were like being badasses and everything. And I thought those guys were really tedious and boring. But on the other hand, I learned how to fix a car, real basic. I can't do it now because cars have evolved and I have not. But I could, I remember learning how to do a brake job. I learned how to adjust a carburetor when we still had them and shit like that. I learned how to work with wood and use tools and not cut my thumbs off. I mean, I thought those things, that started for us in middle school. Okay. And I'm wondering if that's still emphasized, those practical skills. Another thing none of you really learn how to do if your parents don't do it, you don't learn how to shop or prepare a meal. I think that's valuable. Now, you might say, well, gee, aren't your parents supposed to do that? You know what? We don't have one income families anymore where mom stays home. We don't have that. The only real world class I had was a semester of an economics class. Yeah, well, sometimes that's really good, My uncle on my mom's side taught economics in high school for, I think, 30 years. And yeah, electives. Yeah, I think it was there too. But one of the things that he did, apropos what Raphael is saying, and a couple of others have suggested, he would teach students, what an interest rate was. And he would teach students how credit cards worked and things like that. It wasn't just obscure economic principles. He was teaching them practical money management kind of stuff, That's something most of us, I didn't get that in school, What else? What else did you not get where you by the time you got out of high school, you're like, you know what? By the time I graduated, I realized I'd never learned to do this, and now I wish I had.
For me, main thing was like I wanted to like learn how to do taxes and all that stuff and be comfortable with handling our money. And I had also another like a semester of an economics class, but it was macroeconomics, not micro. So, and this was a required class. So we like learned general economic concepts and the broad system of how the American world economy works, but nothing like, oh yeah, I can use that in my world now. Doesn't really help that I know how to change Chinese dollars to American dollars and how those interest rates work for myself. I would like to learn how to do more specific things, but we just did not have any other classes that were more hands-on real world. Like my stats teacher was going to teach us, even though I knew how to do this already, teach us how to change a tire. We didn't get to do that because of COVID, but I don't think a stats teacher should be teaching us how to change a tire.
No, I mean, like your parents should do that, or your uncle or whatever, your aunt should teach you. Some adult in your family, man. I mean, I think I taught my sister how to change a tire. Okay. And I'm pretty sure that my dad taught me, but, or it might have been my brother. I can't remember, but it was one or the other. But I mean, we don't learn these real basic skills, and we get the idea then, oh, well, we pay people to do that. Why? Why would you pay someone to change a tire? It's 10 minutes of work, and then you got to, one of those little stupid tiny tires, but, I mean, it's no big deal. People blow tires out. It happens. But, we've created almost like a dependent middle class that is no longer self-reliant. And it seems to me that one of the things that we used to rely on with a combination of our families and public education was some sense of self-reliance. Yeah, getting to, I think what Sarah was talking about, the idea of, okay, when I get out into the real world, I'm not going to be overwhelmed. Some things are going to surprise me. The first time I had to pay rent, it was a bit of a shock. But I knew how to do it, and I knew what it was, and I knew how it worked. And as I said, I could more or less keep a crappy car running for a while and things like that. I don't think your generation really learns those things. Yeah, a lot of people pay someone else to do their taxes. Yeah, they do. I understand.
Well, like you
that.
mentioned with cars, cars nowadays are designed so that you can't work on them in your driveway. They don't want you to.
But you can change a tire and you can change your oil.
Right.
Right. You can do things like that. And those things are expensive.
Yeah, my dad helped, became a mechanic.
Well, he was a phenomenal
when he was young, just because he just bugged someone enough until they taught him real simple shit in his driveway, or he had a job changing oil and someone just taught him how to slowly do timing belts and valve jobs and stuff. And nowadays everything he learned, so much of it just isn't he can't apply it. You need to take your car to a dealership and have them scan it 5 times with 5 different computers that all cost 30 grand. And
Yeah, and part of that is, and maybe this is something we got to think about on, or everybody really, have we overemphasized convenience over comprehension, over understanding how things work? You know, there's a certain convenience in things that seems to be predicated on the idea, you don't need to know how this works. Never mind, it will work. Right up to the point where it doesn't. Cars are a classic example of that, but I can think of any number of other things. I first started really to become aware of that when computers, personal computers, were really starting to get big in the 80s, and realizing I got to learn how to do this. I got to learn how to program. I got to learn this language. I got to know what I'm doing, because I took the same mentality toward computers that I had toward cars. This thing is going to break down when no one's here to fix it. I got to know how to do that. I don't think many people do that anymore. You know, most of you don't know how a computer works. And there are always going to be a few of you who are like, no, I know how to fix it. But most of you won't. And so you're going to have to pay somebody to do it. That creates a dependency. Now, there's nothing wrong with an interdependent society, and a lot of things right with that. What we have to understand, is that the best way always to do things? Are we using, for example, the K through 12 educational system to raise our children because our parents don't want to do it or can't anymore? I mean, that's a genuine concern. My generation, I've seen a lot of people I know who are like the most negligent parents I've ever seen. And it isn't like you're walking around, with training wheels on your kid, but just that thing of being there, in some way or another for your kids and being useful to them, teaching them shit. I know a lot of people who just don't, they'll brag when their kid does something cool, but I've known people who didn't know what their kids were doing, didn't know what their kids were interested in. And that's kind of staggering. And I know a lot of primary and secondary teachers who have assumed kind of surrogate parent role for the kids they're teaching. That doesn't seem very healthy to me, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm trying to kind of throw things out there. You know what? I'm sorry, but I need to stop for just a second. I got to go talk to my neighbor for just a second, because I don't know if you're picking it up or not, but there's a lot of noise there and it's starting to get distracting. Can you hold on for just a couple of minutes? I'm really sorry. I will be. That was interesting. Sorry, but I'm really sorry. But I guess some people decided that they had to air their grievances out for the entire human species. And I don't know if you can any of you hear that? A little shouting match going on out there. Wow, that's good. That's why I try to keep my microphone turned down. Anyway, so one of the things to think about as an institution is public education, because an important component of all public education systems is not that thing of creating, safe individuals. It's socialization. Here are our values. Here's what the power structure looks like, and here's where you belong. Here's where you fit in. So a lot of education, despite what a lot of people will tell you, is really about here are the institutional standards to which you must conform. And you'll know whether or not you're good or bad because you either will or will not conform to these things. Okay? So is that something that's just inevitable and important, that everybody has to learn to kind of conform at some point? What about policing? The enforcement of law and the whole notion of the rule of law. is that more or less intact in the United States? Are there things that really need to be changed, or is it like, well, we can kind of like what Sarah was saying with education, we can do better, but it's sort of tweak it at the edges. What do you think?
I think we've tasked our law enforcement with some pretty bad policies over the years. And like we were talking about before, it's not a good thing to be number one worldwide in incarceration. That really doesn't make us look good.
Yeah, and there are plenty of other ways in which that looks even worse when you start looking at it. What do we do? What do you propose? So let's not be like Marx. Let's not just diagnose but not prescribe.
I think CompStat and the idea of stat-based policing has really been pretty integral in that. People vote for politicians who are tough on crime. If you live in a large city like DC or Baltimore or Philly, you're really concerned about crime. So how do you measure that? Well, with statistics. So, how do you get it to go down? You tell, if you're like the deputy ops, you tell people to each in their district, each commander to reduce crime by this, this number. We need this many felonies, or we can't go over this many homicides by the year end. But it's like, how do you do that? So a lot of the times, stats end up getting cooked. Things that assaults get written up as just menacing, things like that. It creates a big level of mistrust in communities too. The whole like broken windows theory of, if we police smaller infractions like open liquor and all that stuff, then that will deter harsher crime. I think that really breaks a lot of the trust in a community, and they don't see police officers as like an integral part of their community. They see them as like an outside force. I just think that entire way of stat-based policing and like electing politicians on promises of reduction in crime, and they just show you all these numbers and charts, I don't think that's really gotten us in a very good place.
Why do you think that the whole tough on crime campaign bullet point is as effective as it is? Because really, crime rates in the United States are far below what they were, for example, when I was your age, far below. So really, I mean, we've been tough on crime for a long time, which is why we have so many people behind bars and on parole. We shoot more people than almost any other developed country, our police.
Yeah.
Whether or not they kill them, they shoot them. I was just doing some interesting work for somebody on comparative crime analyses. And I don't know if you've ever heard in England, there was a really, really brutal set of criminal twins called the Cray twins, right? And they were really, kind of at their peak in the 50s and 60s. Here's an interesting thing, though. It's like one of the things that happened in the early 60s in England was the first time recorded that a police officer shot and killed someone. That was in the 1960s. And
really?
It was. I mean, it stunned me. I knew that they didn't carry weapons. You had to, even as recently as far back as then, police officers had to go and check out weapons, and only under certain circumstances could they be armed. And everybody knew that. But also, the penalties for killing police officers were really severe. So the idea was the other side knew too. It's like, the one thing I don't want to do is shoot a cop. I might beat you up, but you're going to beat me up as soon as, because that was the other part of it. It was the Metropolitan Police Force in London was one of the, if not the most corrupt on the planet, well into the 20th century. And part of that was they were brutal. They were absolutely vicious with the people they had in custody. And they could tell lawyers, no, you cannot be present when we're questioning this guy. Go away, and things like that. But on the other hand, they had relatively low crime rates. And they did remarkably little killing of suspects and things like that. That they become more like America, particularly in the last 25, 30 years or so. And they begun to look more militarized, same as the American police. But prior to that, it was astonishing when the police and even the Met, as corrupt as it was, when they would actually just go and, like break in and kill people. That just didn't happen. If you think about the history of crime and violence and law enforcement in the United States, and you think about like the 20s and 30s, I mean, yeah, criminals were violent. It was a consequence of new hardware that came out of World War I. That was where we had automatic weapons. But so were the police, because the police had machine guns and they used them routinely. That Thompson submachine gun, that Chicago typewriter, that wasn't just used by gangsters. That was used by police too. And they would spray a room. We've had a long history of police violence. And the idea that the posture of the police is these people here, those are bad guys. As opposed to, well, my job here is to keep the peace. There are cops who, like a lot of local cops, they're just like, okay, that's enough, lads, enough of that, But one way to stop a fight, shoot somebody. And it just seems like more and more, it isn't necessarily the case, I don't know, that it's the people who go into law enforcement. A lot of times it's the training. When you start taking police officers, metropolitan police officers, domestic law enforcement people, and training them to kill, you're doing something that most of the rest of the world doesn't do. And again, if anybody's misunderstanding this isn't about the police. This is about police training, And I was really astonished when I started looking into this. I did some statistical work for the Oregon State Police about 15 years ago. And I remember meeting with one of the higher up officers in the state police. And he was saying that one of the things that was really concerning him with the Portland police was that they were training police officers to beat the crap out of people and to menace them with guns and things like that. And, the Portland police have been under federal scrutiny by the United States Justice Department several times just in the last 20 years. Because when we think of Portland, I think most of us think of like, hipsters and man buns and, I don't know, avocado something. But they also have one of the most brutal police forces on the West Coast, and that includes San Francisco and LA. It seems like something's wrong there. So what do you do? I mean, on the one hand, we are a federal republic and we devolve a lot of law enforcement authority to the states and localities to do as they see fit. And so, we might get people who, they look at a certain community, they don't live in that community, and they look at the people who do live in that community as the problem that needs to be solved rather than people whose homes and businesses need to be protected. Do we have a national police force? We kind of do, I guess, with the FBI, but, what do you do? How do you change that? If Owen's right, and if I'm understanding you, and the idea is, we're incarcerating too many people and we're using that, as a way of responding to crime that might very well be motivated by something other than the imperfection of human nature. Are we putting too many people behind bars? In other words, you have to decide this. I can argue it either way. Some people say, well, we should have a national death penalty. Here's one of the things we know, though. The death penalty does not serve as a deterrent to crime. It just doesn't. There's no evidence at all that the death penalty is an effective way of reducing violent crime. And so if we're imprisoning too many people, we do have to ask ourselves why. Why are we doing that? One of the reasons that a lot of people don't talk about has to do with part of what Owen mentioned in terms of who we vote for. What I'm suggesting is not just who we vote for, it's who votes. Okay? Overwhelmingly, it's the affluent middle class and above who are the ones who turn out in the biggest numbers, right? It's people living in the suburbs and the exurbs, and the more cosmopolitan parts of big cities are the people who turn out to vote, especially if they're fairly well off. By the way, race is not a determinant at all. When you control for socioeconomic factors, people of color tend to turn out at higher rates than white people. But we know that the people who do vote are the affluent. And what they want is they want their affluence protected. And so the police know this, and the DAs know this. You'll see this if you ever serve on jury duty. I mean, and it isn't, I'm not talking about corruption. It's just that there's a value system that makes assumptions that sometimes can be a little disturbing, Is it worthwhile to have a corrupt police force if your property is safer? Or to have a violent police force if your property is safer? For a lot of Americans, the answer is absolutely, emphatically yes. I don't care about them. They are the problem. That's deeply baked in to American political culture right now. And Owen and a couple of others you who invoke this are absolutely right to suggest that routinely both Democrats and Republicans will use this to gain office. This idea of not only, sort of, first of all, obviously fear of the poor, partly because in middle-class America, one of the reasons you fear the poor is because you fear poverty, because you're closer to it than you like. You're a paycheck away. That's what COVID has revealed to a lot of people. They were a paycheck away from poverty. And we know that there are strong correlations between generational poverty and crime. We know those things exist, and yet we don't do much about generational poverty. Social welfare in the United States could arguably be one monumental failure. Now, some people would argue that one of the reasons why social welfare hasn't really led to more of a leveling is that it was never really intended to. That given that it was driven disproportionately by Democrats trying to expand their voter base, right? It was patronage politics. Remember where that welfare check came from. It came from a Democratic administration. That is a view of social welfare, just like it is also a view of urban renewal. In other words, the original plans for urban renewal in big cities were derived from the progressive movement and the idea that if you put people in warehouses, they will begin to behave like rats in a maze. They will just look around, and they'll feed on each other. It's like starving rats and sticking them in a box. Okay, so what you got to do is you got to give them more of a sense of a tranquil, safe, secure space. That means visibility. One of the things we know about human beings, we're much more comfortable when we've got visibility, when we can see what's around. That's why the classic suburban home, at least since the 50s, has been a yard with short grass and a tree. I mean, there's something primal about that. The idea that that tree represents potential escape from adversaries, a source of security. It gives you shade, but it doesn't impede your visibility. Human beings like to be able to look out the window and know what's going on, especially when their neighbors begin to have interesting shouting matches, colorful language. But, if you deny people that and you stick them in boxes and you build those boxes, 25 floors high, you're just warehousing them. So what happened was the original plans called for these open spaces, and also another thing that human beings like, bodies of water. Human beings like water because we know we last about 5 days without it. Even though we're not going to go drink that water, we like, the sound of water is soothing to us. The sight of water is reassuring to us, All those things were taken away. Because what was found out pretty quickly was the people who won the bids for those contracts were the same people who build other institutional buildings like prisons. And those buildings in those tenement blocks start to look a lot like prisons. Have you ever wondered, for example, why so many of the schools built between the 50s and the 70s look like the Joint? Because they were built by the same people, and when you went inside, they felt the same way. I never realized that until I went in to teach a class in Folsom Prison. And I was like, man, this reminds me of being in third grade, except with a lot scarier people, So maybe part of this is it again, that sense of convenience? It's somebody else's problem. Let them deal with it. Well, but they're going to warehouse them. You know what? Those people had their chance and they failed. Go ahead and warehouse them. Or better yet, bring back the death penalty and kill them in those states that don't have a death penalty. Never mind that it's not a disincentive to commit a violent crime. It does nothing measurable to deter violent crime. We know from thousands of interviews with violent offenders, they're always asked, did you ever consider the possibility that the state has the death penalty? No. A lot of guys don't even know. A lot of people just don't even know if their state has a death penalty. They don't care. They just don't care. You know, when you get to that point where you're going to take a human life, you're going to beat somebody into submission, you're not thinking then. You're not thinking about the implications of what you're doing. You're just trying to kick somebody's ass or take their stuff. Okay, so that means, you know, the death penalty is useless as anything other than what? A convenience. Okay, now you see, I can argue that way. I can argue another way as well, but I feel like I'm talking too much and I want to hear more. What else? Maybe there's something in criminal justice we need to think about. That's my point. A couple of you have mentioned the cost of secondary education or post-secondary education, the cost of university education. Why should we reduce it? University education isn't for everybody. At least it hasn't been for the entire history of the country.
Maybe because if it's not for everybody, maybe they just couldn't achieve it because it was too expensive. So they just like come up with this excuse saying that it's just not for them then, because they know they won't be able to afford it.
How do we know if someone is suited to a university, if they're ready for it? How do we know? We give them the SAT or one of those scholastic aptitude kind of tests, and what we look at their grade point in high school, and what we usually see is that generally speaking, the people with high grades and high SAT scores can afford education. But again, what I'm asking is, why do people in poverty deserve the same chance at higher education as people who aren't poor? Why? You see, we're invoking a value. What I'm trying to get at is, what do you value, or what do you believe about human nature? Do you believe that people's environment is such a significant impediment to their success that we need to eliminate the impediment even if we can't fix the environment? I'm trying to get it. In other words, I'm arguing to make a point. I'm not arguing my belief. But why do people who are poor deserve to go to college? Because you're saying they deserve to. Why does anybody deserve to go to college? Because most of the time, the higher paying jobs require a higher education. Well, I can give you a couple that can be higher paying and don't require a higher education, and I can start with being a thief. Criminals can make a lot of money. They make a lot more money than fast food workers. They make a lot more money than school teachers, right up to the point where they go to the joint. Generally speaking, they make a lot of money. They can. But also, European systems, for example, have what they call trade schools. And in order to get into universities, you kind of have to test your way in. And a lot of people can't cut that. But they still can get higher education, but they're more likely to get higher education in a more specific trade. Now, that ain't perfect. What's the problem with a system like that? Where you say to somebody, okay, you know what, you can't get into university, but here are X number of trade schools you can choose from, and you can be trained in a specific kind of profession.
You aren't really giving some people the opportunity to expand, and become more educated and literate, that, might go on to do something that they're truly passionate about.
Why should we care? That's their problem.
Because they're a part of our society. We have to.
That's right. They're a part of our society, and our society needs plumbers.
Right.
Right. Our society needs mechanics. Our society needs, people to work on the assembly line. It needs a lot of those people. You know what it doesn't need very many? Creative people.
Yeah. You
know how we know that? We don't have very many genuinely creative people. For example, think about music. A lot of people have made a lot of money making music, when music once was made, right? I worked around musicians for a lot of years in various capacities, and I know a lot of people who stayed in the business after I got out of it. Almost none of them were formally trained as musicians. Almost none of them. I mean, if you look at any prominent, like a classic example would be hip hop. There's no real training for that in terms of you don't go to school to learn hip hop. And, it's like, or jazz. It used to be like jazz was the soundtrack of America until rock and roll replaced it in the late 50s, early 60s, and then rock after that, and so on, right? Those guys, most of them, they had individual lessons. They were in like school band or something, but they learned by taking private lessons from people as private individuals with whatever they could afford. And they learned on the stand. They learned at the gig on the stand, and they failed until they either quit or stopped failing. There's an argument that that does a lot for someone in terms of their sense of accomplishment. The idea that, no one's really gonna, no one's under any obligation to help me. Some people might along the way teach me something or offer me something, but I got to show them that I have value. And if I don't do that, then it seems to me I don't deserve their consideration. Maybe I better go and do another thing. Maybe I better drive a cab. I'm trying to devil's advocate here. Very few people in this country are going to make productive use of their literacy. Americans almost never read, on average, American adults do not read more than about one book a year to completion. We just don't read. I know from teaching at this university for almost 26 years that a significant portion of my students read as little as possible, as little as they can manage. So why should I be concerned? Why should I be worried about having a literate population when so many Americans are not going to make productive use of that literacy? The hell with them. Come on now, I'm trying to give you something to push against.
Maybe because there's like, it may not be just like sitting down to read a book, but maybe they need literacy for just doing basic tasks at their job, read instructions, or make some of the more useful multimedia stuff that we take for granted that does have a lot of words and stuff in it, maybe.
Except that most Americans don't do that. I mean, keep in mind that an extraordinarily high percentage of adult Americans are almost inarticulate when they try to write something down. That includes university educated Americans, but more so if you've never been to university. That the idea of actually communicating in some sort of written language is just monstrously difficult, particularly for younger Americans. Because you are, in terms of the way information is transmitted and received and processed, you're much more visual. Okay. You're more likely to watch a YouTube video or it's analog or see something on Instagram than you are to actually read it in a magazine or a newspaper or in a book. Okay. And so that literacy skill just may not be that important anymore. Or maybe there's different kind of literacy. In other words, you have media literacy, right? You may be more sophisticated in how to look at something that's produced for television or theater and be able to know how it's done, even if you can't do it yourself. You might have a certain media sophistication. But as far as being creative, we're not producing any more genuinely creative people than we ever did. And yet the act of creation has never been easier, just in terms of digital assistance and software to actually process music for you and all kinds of things. I don't see a renaissance of creativity, really.
We don't place a lot of importance on, reading for leisure, things like that. We don't place a whole lot of importance on reading or anything that doesn't make you more money, in the short term.
Or just give you more fun. It's
yeah,
fun.
exactly.
I think our reading now is like binge watching stuff online.
Right.
And that's fun. Don't get me wrong. It's fun.
You read posts on social media or headlines and shit. You don't really sit down but everything, all those shows you watch, everything you do, there's a writer, there's a team of writers behind all that.
Yeah. And one of the things that we've noticed in terms of doing media studies is in some ways, contemporary media have never been better. I mean, this is a kind of golden age especially for long form television. We're producing long form television that's just magnificent in its quality. Visually, it's stunning. A lot of the writing is really brilliant. I mean, you look at the kind of stuff, even though they may be taking themes that are very familiar and cliche and there are only so many variations on the human condition anyway. But as far as the writing, it can be genuinely incisive. And then you come and find out how many of those writers are 50, you know. And so one of the real concerns is, where are the young writers going to come from? Because I can tell you where they're not coming from. They're not coming from hip hop. Because that's not what that world is about. It's sort of like, when you think about poetry, people who are great poets are very seldom great at prose. They have a certain way that they're best at expressing themselves. Hip hop's more in that world. You know, there's a kind of blunt force poetry to a lot of hip hop, but you're not going to find very many hip hop artists who can compose music, who actually understand what they're doing. And again, you could very well say the same thing of every rock star from the 60s. Most of those people, they were mostly men, had no idea what they were doing. You know, classic example of that is Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck to this day still can't read music. And he's one of those throwback 60s rock and roll legend kind of guys. But getting back to education, is that our problem? Do we need to worry about whether or not everyone has the possibility, you know, that we have to make sure that everyone has a chance to express their inner genius when there's every likelihood that no such thing exists? In other words, do we make a mistake with our educational system, reinforced by the way that we market things, when we try to convince people that they're special? When the brutal truth of it is that we are all as interchangeable as piston rods, all of us. I mean, that's, you know, really, come on, let's not kid ourselves, right? You might be very nice, but there are plenty of very nice people. You know, you might be very funny. There are probably not as many funny people as I wish there were, but you know what I'm saying? In other words, why do we need to think that we're special instead of thinking that we have value, which is different? How many times were you asked by your parents or anybody else, not told that you were special and everybody's a winner, but asked, what have you done? Before you thought about, well, I should have the opportunity, ask yourself, why? Why me? Because, you know, again, I know it's generational. I did not grow up with any sense of entitlement at all. None. And the expectation was, boy, you are going to work with your back for the rest of your life because you ain't that bright. Because everybody around me was kind of doing the same thing. They either got drafted and went to Vietnam if they were a little older than me, or they went to prison, or, you know, most of them, you know, a few of them maybe sometime down the road might have gotten a little community college or something, but, you know, there was no sense of, I should have a chance to go to college. I never even thought about it. You know, do we make a mistake in terms of how we structure society? Think about what Plato said about, you know, the producers and the auxiliaries and the guardians. I mean, isn't there a kind of honesty in that, however corrupt it might become, where you're saying, look, I mean, most of us really, you know, we shouldn't vote, we shouldn't be involved. Democracy is a dumb idea. You know, people are ignorant. You know, we got no impulse control. You know, we can be convinced by somebody who says, oh yeah, law and order, you know, kill them all, let God sort it out. I'll vote for that person. Is that really democracy working? I mean, you know, that's what I want you to start thinking about. In other words, think about the different people's ideas we've looked at, not the people, but their ideas, and think, is there anything useful in that we could use to kind of fix what's broken in the United States, but preserve what works? Okay? That's what I want you to think about. It seems like you didn't want to talk about this today. Are you liable to want to talk about it on Wednesday? Okay, here's what I would like you to do for Wednesday, okay? I would like you to just, in a couple of lines, sketch out, here are two things. Here's one thing I think is worth preserving and fixing. Here's another thing I think should be abolished and replaced. and be ready to talk about that on Wednesday. Okay? Because I still felt like I did too much of the talking today, because I do have an obligation to teach, but I was kind of hoping this would be more of an exchange. There were some really interesting points raised, but I think you should really, you got to let it flow a little bit. You know, you got to trust yourselves. You've learned a lot this term. You really have. Now you got to trust yourself enough to try it out, you know, run it around the track a few times. Okay. Anything else? Okay, then if there is nothing else, I guess I will see you all here on Wednesday. In the meantime, you might take a look at the prompt for that last essay in case you have questions on Wednesday that I can answer. I'll see you then. Okay.
Thank you.